Well, hey, y'all, I'm Sam, and I am so excited to be with y'all tonight. I actually just started working at Menlo a couple months ago. I moved here at the beginning of March, about 2 weeks before we went into shelter in place. And so, needless to say, it has been a crazy season of transition for me over the past couple of months. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity tonight to have a conversation with you about this season's series that we're in this summer. We're going to be looking at the life of Paul, and we're going to be actually reading through 2 letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison to the church, the book of Colossians and the book of Philippians. And so I'm excited to dive into that this summer. And a really cool thing, if you haven't had the opportunity yet already, you can follow along with us this summer through a daily devotional that we have. And if you haven't seen that yet, it's no worries. You can actually find it online at menlo.church/seasons. And that's just a really cool opportunity for us to dive in together, to talk through the different things and just process together. It's a great thing. Do it with your life group, do it with a friend. Let's just commit to doing it together this summer. But last week, we heard from Matt about the Apostle Paul, and he introduced us to his story. He shared about how Paul had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus that changed everything for him. It was on this road and on the encounter with the road to Damascus that Paul all of a sudden went from one day persecuting Christians and he was out to get them to the next day he's proclaiming the goodness and the gospel and the glory of God. And so Paul's story is crazy, and I really want tonight for us to spend a little bit of time talking about what happened between the road to Damascus and the following years of Paul to when he ended up in prison. Because I think it gives us a lot of context and some good information and a little bit of insight into the words that he ended up writing in Colossians and Philippians. So we're going to be in the book of Acts tonight. We're going to share a little bit. We're going to read through a couple different things. But the first thing that I want you to be aware of, and this is really important for the big picture of who Paul is that Paul was a Roman citizen. And being a Roman citizen back in the day was a very big deal. It was kind of like the ultimate status symbol. People who were Roman citizens, if they weren't Roman citizens, they would actually pay money to become one. So people loved being Roman citizens. It was a really, really big deal. And Paul was naturally born one. So he was a Roman citizen. And because of that, he had a lot of privilege and status that was given to him just because of where he was born. And this is an interesting thing to think about in the context of our world right now. And to put it into a very cheesy, hypothetical situation, I want you to think for a minute with me that someone on, I don't know, maybe like TikTok or Instagram, that they have like 1 billion followers, okay? Just imagine they have 1 billion followers, but they didn't do anything to get those followers. They just logged in, they signed up for the app, and all of a sudden they had all of these followers. Now they're real followers, no ghosting or anything like that, like legitimate followers, right? So they have all these followers and they have a status because of the followers that they have, but they didn't do anything to earn that. That would be a privilege that person had because it was just given to them and they didn't have to do anything. And so that's a little bit the context I want you to think through the lens of Paul, that he had this privilege that other people during that time didn't have simply because he was a Roman citizen. And what we're going to see in the story tonight and in the weeks to come is that Paul used his privilege as a Roman citizen in very, very calculated ways. And I'm excited to look into this a little bit with you. Okay, so Paul essentially gets thrown in prison. So road to Damascus happens a long while back. We fast forward in Acts chapter 23. And Paul's in prison. It's a few times that he's been in prison. And during this time, I would imagine he's feeling like a little discouraged. I don't know what it's like to be in prison, but I feel like being discouraged would be one of the things. And so in Acts 23:11, this crazy scene happens where the Lord appears to Paul. He shows up while Paul's in prison. He shows up, which really thinking about it might not be weird for Paul because he already had an encounter with him on the road to Damascus, but just to run with it, I think it would be still kind of strange being in prison and God just showing up. But what we see in Acts 23:11 is that God had a very specific message for Paul. God said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." In this moment, God gave Paul a clear picture of his purpose. God told Paul, okay, right now you are in prison, you are in Jerusalem in prison, but I'm gonna send you to Rome. You're going there. You're going to Rome at some point. We don't know when, but I want you to go to Rome. And so I would imagine for Paul, as he's sitting there in prison, that this is a big moment. And it actually, every time I read this story, it always reminds me of that part in The Lion King, you know, when Simba's like been off, he's like doing his thing, and you're like, come on, come back. Like you need to go back, save your family, life isn't good there. And then Mufasa appears to Simba. He appears to Simba and he tells him in a very, very like really awesome voice, which I can't even try to mimic, but he tells Simba, remember who you are. Remember who you are. In that moment, changed everything for Simba. That Simba then went on, he went back, saved Pride Rock, all the things. So the things we love about that story. But this is kind of a similar situation, a little different, very different. But I always think of that when I read this story, that it had to have, for Paul, felt a little crazy. That God's telling him, hey, this is what's gonna happen. You are headed to Rome. But I don't want you to miss this next part of the story because it's crazy. Paul is told by God that he is going to be sent to Rome, but that doesn't happen quickly. Paul actually, right after this, gets sent to a port city called Caesarea. Paul spends a couple of years in Caesarea just waiting, trying to see what will happen next. He's waiting in prison in Caesarea. And the strange thing about this, I can't imagine how discouraged Paul would have been had he not been reminded at the start of this that he was going to be going to Rome. I would imagine that if that voice, if that wasn't in the back of his head, he would have been so discouraged because he's in Caesarea. He's in the wrong spot. God said he's going to Rome, but he's in the wrong spot. But Paul remained steadfast in what God had for him. Even though he was in prison in Caesarea, it's during this time in prison and another time in prison that he writes multiple books that we now have in the Bible. He sent encouraging letters to different churches and encouraged fellow believers in this season, in a season where he could have just checked out and said, I guess I just gotta wait. He didn't do that. He chose to use that season and to let God work in him in the midst of that. So what happens in the book of Acts, this whole thing, honestly, y'all, is like a scene out of a Hollywood movie. Like I can't even begin to describe to you how crazy the next few things are. So he's in Jerusalem, God appears to him, tells him that he's going to Rome. He ends up getting sent to Caesarea. But on the way of getting sent to Caesarea, it's crazy. They had to secretively take him there because people caught wind that they were gonna move him and people really didn't like Paul and they wanted him killed. And so they were gonna ambush him on the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So they had to do it in secret. And there was this whole group of people that literally said, they were like, I'm not gonna eat until Paul is killed. But spoiler alert, they totally ate because Paul ended up making it safely to Caesarea. So really crazy. Again, I recommend reading it because it is fascinating. And if you followed along in the reading plan, you read some of it this week. So way to go. So Paul ends up in Caesarea. He's waiting for time to pass. And then this moment comes where he essentially is told by the ruler at the time that they want to send him back to Jerusalem. And Paul was not having this. Paul knew, because God told him, Paul knew that he was supposed to go to Rome. And so rather than going back to Jerusalem, which if geography is hard for you like it is for me, not the right way. Going back to where you came from is not getting Paul anywhere closer to where he needs to be in Rome. So Paul, in this moment, he chooses to use the privilege that he has as a Roman citizen to ask to be sent to Rome. And let me explain this a little bit. Because of the privilege that Paul had, because he was a Roman citizen, he could essentially say, I'm going to lay all my cards on the table and I am going to ask to be sent to the highest court. I'm going to be sent to the highest court and I'm going to be dealt with there. And so that's what Paul does. But the wild thing about this is that everyone who knew anything about Paul in this season knew that Paul's case and why he was even being held in prison was kind of a joke. It was sort of like a case of corrupt leaders where they were just passing him off from one person to the next. And he ended up staying there for a long while as a result of these corrupt leaders. So it wouldn't have made any sense for Paul to do this right now if he hadn't been told by the Lord that he needed to go to Rome. So Paul used this moment in time and he said, I'm going to appeal my case to Caesar. I'm going to go. I'm going to Caesar and because Rome, that's where I know that I am supposed to go. And then in Acts 26, this super interesting part happens where Paul says that he's going to go to Rome and they're kind of him-hoing and hawing back and forth about when they're going to send him. And he ends up interacting with a king that comes on the scene. His name's King Agrippa. King Agrippa shows up in Acts 26 and he starts, essentially Agrippa knew who Paul was and he wanted to hear Paul's story for himself. And so he has this moment with Paul where Paul could have chosen to pretty much defend himself. He could have said, King Agrippa, let me tell you how everything around here has not been going well. Let me tell you why I shouldn't be in prison. That is what Paul very easily could have done in that moment. But you guys, Paul didn't do that. Paul used this moment in time when he was in front of King Agrippa to share his testimony. It's in this moment that Paul was able to use his privilege to proclaim the glory of God. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Paul hadn't done that. If Paul had chosen to be more concerned with his own glory rather than the glory of God. If he had chosen that human flesh desire to tell them that they were wrong, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to proclaim God's glory and goodness through sharing his testimony. And so Paul goes through and he talks to King Agrippa. And I can't help but notice that I really think that part of the reason why Paul was so passionate about using his privilege to proclaim the glory of God is because of the example that he saw in Jesus. And in Philippians chapter 2, we'll be diving in the next couple of weeks in this chapter, but Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, it says that Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so if the creator of the universe could literally put aside his own privilege of being the creator and humble himself to become obedient to death, even death on a cross, I would imagine that Paul putting aside his privilege as a Roman citizen was a little bit easier for him. Paul's example was Jesus. And as the story goes on, and as I think of my own life, the question that I ask myself is, am I more focused on my own glory, or am I focused on God's glory? Am I more concerned about what people think of me, or am I more concerned about what God thinks of me? And I think that it's hard because, if we were sitting across the table having a conversation, it'd be a little different. But I just want you to imagine that we are, and I want you to know that I don't know where you fall tonight. I don't know if you're just kind of figuring this Jesus thing out, if you're just kind of exploring it, trying to figure out who Jesus is, or I don't know if you'd say that you're walking through life with Jesus. But what my encouragement and my challenge for us tonight is that we as a people, we need to make some choices. And one of the first choices that I think we need to make is that we need to identify our own privileges. And this has been a really hot topic lately with everything that's been happening around America with racism and the unrest that's been happening. And I want to acknowledge and say that as an educated white woman, I know that I have privileges. And you guys, even living in the area that we live in, we have so many privileges. There are those of us who are able to have tutors to help us with the really big, hard test that's coming up. There's many of us that have never had to worry about where our next meal is coming from. There are so many of us who get to spend our summers carefree because we don't have to help our family make ends meet. Because of the affluent area that we live in, we have so many privileges. And the result of this, and even talking through this and identifying the privileges that we have, it's not to make us feel guilty. It's not to make us feel like, oh man, well, I have these things and other people don't, so I just feel really guilty. That's not the response that should come. The response and the overflow from something like this should be a response and an overflow of empathy. That we're able to look at our neighbors, that we're able to look at people in our classes, and we're able to say, I know that your life is really different than mine. Help me understand. Have conversations with people. And I think that there are so many ways that we can move forward in this. And I want, as a community, maybe with your life group, as you talk through these things, I want you to identify some next steps for you. What are some next steps that you need to take in order to move this idea of privilege and everything that you have in order to help people around you? And a few things. I think of summer and free time that you have, that maybe you could spend time volunteering more. Or even the hygiene drive coming up, that we can spend time and fill up those packs and drop them off or volunteer at the drive. There are so many ways that we can identify the ways that we are privileged, and then that we can help people around us. And I just imagine what our world would look like if we had more of us that were aware of the things that we have been gifted with, the blessings that we have, and then if we were a people that chose to go out and serve those around us. Gosh, I want to live in that world. And y'all, I believe that we can help be that change. My friend Jess Connolly says that our lives should be about the glory of God and the good of others. I love that analogy, that our lives should be for the glory of God and the good of others. And so as we think of our lives, as we think of the privileges that we have, my prayer is that we would be people who identify our privileges and that we use our privileges for the good of others. And that we use the privileges that we have, just like Paul did, to bring glory to God. And y'all, I think if we do that together, man, talk about a way of being able to spread hope this summer. I'm going to pray for us. God, I thank you for your love and your care for us. I thank you for each one of us that are so blessed by the gifts that you have given us. And God, I pray that you would help us identify the privileges that we have. And God, would you give us next steps of what you have for us? Give us eyes to see the people around us. Give us eyes to see the people in our life group, and help us love one another in a deeper way. God, help us use our privileges for your glory and for the good of others. We love you. Amen.